Can everyone hear me? So Sri Lanka is at a crossroads and has been at a crossroads for some decades. I think what's particularly notable about this particular crossroad is the fact that the crisis is not only political, it's not only a security crisis, it's not only an economic crisis, it's all of these combined, and in some sense a crisis of the state as well. I think for the first time, the state lost a monopoly on violence in its very capital, which was quite an extraordinary thing. So I'm going to start with the economic aspects, so I'm not going to go into that. The other two, on credit, everyone I'm sure here is aware that Sri Lanka tapped sovereign bond markets for the first time in 2007. Up till that point, even though half of our debt was denominated in dollars to external creditors, it was largely concessional. It was entirely concessional and often on very, very favorable terms, IDA credits and so on. That changed in 2007. In about 10 years, half of our external debt stock became capital markets debt, largely through the device of international sovereign bonds and Sri Lanka development bonds. So that generated a huge amount of rollover risk and put Sri Lanka on the course to sovereign default that we have now come to. So that's credit. Then in terms of competence, I think people are well aware that wasteful expenditure in the form of white elephant infrastructure projects, that's very visible, but also in terms of the huge expansion of the public sector that took place between 2005 and 2015. I think in the 3 or so decades before, the public sector doubled in size, and then in that decade alone, it nearly doubled again. And that's at a time when the demographic profile was not expanding as quickly as in the past. Then we have the military as well. Post-war, there was no resizing of the military in terms of manpower. So I think those are other arguments that currently exist in the public realm. Now, the argument I'm going to make is that all these three elements, corruption, credit, and competence, have an underlying, there are many causes, but one important underlying cause is executive dominance and the lack of institutional independence. Corruption, the ability for governments to take on so much debt, high risk, expensive debt, and to spend it in the way it did, could only be possible in a system where there was so much executive dominance and a lack of institutional independence. So some examples of this might be, for example, if we take the fairly light touch fiscal rules that we had, for example, on the borrowing limit. These rules were flouted by the executive, and other branches of government did very little about it. There were cases brought, and those cases were not taken up. And with respect to corruption, we all know the state of cases and the history of impunity, as Bhavani put it, that has existed. With respect to competence, there's no clear process of analysis that took place with respect to the tax cuts. The relevant committees in Parliament, I believe, requested the analysis, but that was not provided. So you see this imbalance in power and in the institutional structure, in particular, the complete politicization of institutions that enabled these three C's to take place. And I think what's also interesting to note is that it is this executive dominance and lack of institutional independence that is also driving many of the issues on the human rights front as well. So this all comes together in this area. And obviously this has been something that everyone in Sri Lanka has been talking about for decades and is well known, and CPA has been in many ways at the center of these discussions with respect to the Constitution. Because they are fundamentally constitutional issues in a sense. What I'd like to argue today is that in a context where economic policy making where human rights and governance issues have been significantly externalized. We have the resolution, we have an IMF program, we have GSP Plus, which together form is essentially the externalization of significant aspects of what would be traditionally domestic policy making. In this context, constitutional reform is always challenging. However, there is considerable space for constitutional reform with a small c. That is, reforms of a constitutional nature that can be driven through primary legislation. And I think that's where I think I'd like to explore a little bit further. And a lot of attention has been on the anti-corruption side of this, in terms of the IMF program in particular. That's helpful. But I think to put a few principles in place, one would be to use legislation to get the state out of the way. So that can be in terms of SOE reform. It could be in terms of potentially changing the role of the military, and so on and so forth. The second would be to reduce executive discretion, both in the economic realm and in other realms. I'm going to focus on the economic one. And these could be through things like more serious fiscal rules, which limit executive discretion with respect to public expenditure and revenue, using formula rather than executive discretion for specific types of taxation, for example, excise taxation. And then there are significant areas of taxation that are essentially subject to the Minister of Finance's discretion in this country. At the stroke of a pen, the Minister of Finance can change customs tariffs, can change a wide range of taxes. Putting these on a primary legislative framework will reduce that discretion and enable hopefully more rational policy making, or at least more stable policy making, by increasing the number of veto players for any given change. And then the third would be to increase the independence of critical institutions in the economic policy making and governance space. So this could be the Monetary Law Act, for example, that would increase the independence of the central bank, but also things like the Attorney General's Department. There have been in other countries measures under IMF programs, and I believe under resolutions as well, to reform, create special prosecutors, so on and so forth. But I'm almost concerned that that is a little bit of a distraction from the fundamental business of resolving the conflicts of interests and the politicization that exists in the official bar. And then the fourth is on impunity, and I'll talk about that in a second when we discuss IMF programs. So I think what's also pertinent to note at this juncture is, in a context where all these issues have been externalized, the external environment itself is changing, in the sense that if you look at IMF programs in the last 6 years, there have been precedents set for a more holistic or approach towards these challenges, towards economic crises, and an acknowledgement of the importance of governance reforms. So I think Verite Research has compiled a very useful list and identified a couple of key features in some of these programs. So if you look, for example, at anti-corruption legislation, and some of these have broader governance elements like reforms, special prosecutors, and so on. In Haiti, in Equatorial Guinea, Iraq, and Ukraine, IMF programs have had these elements. And in Ukraine, they've also created an independent corruption prosecutor's office. So in this context, I think it'll be also interesting to look at the possibility of including some of these reforms as part of this intermestic process that is taking place. In terms of the IMF program itself, of course, the broad contours are in place with the staff level agreement, but there's always changes that can take place before board approval. And then with every review, there's also a sort of process of bargaining that takes place. And I think what will be interesting to note is the domestic political incentives in this context. Following February, the president will have the power to dissolve parliament. he, of course, has no, well, his party has one MP, which is an exceptional situation. In terms of how these actually shape political incentives remains to be seen, but it certainly is an interesting space within which domestic political actors may also be able to use these processes as part of the process of domestic political contestation and therefore create opportunities as well. So I'm going to leave it at that. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks, Daniel. Can I ask Sankita?
Thank you, Bhavani. So looking at corruption as an economic crime, we tend to usually think of corruption as corruption involving finances, procurement fraud, bribery, things like that. But then when we look at what has been transpiring in Sri Lanka lately, we're looking at the massive impact of malgovernance, as was mentioned at the start, on the country in general, leading to the economic crisis as well. So when you talk about abuse of power, abuse of process, conflicts of interest at all levels of government, and what we're seeing really are the signs of state capture. So state capture is a situation where institutions, laws, policies, regulation are abused for personal interest rather than in the public interest. So when you think of that in context, and start looking at what's going on from that lens, you just cannot unsee it. And that's what has led us down this path. If you would have seen in the news lately, TISL with a few other petitioners, one of them present here today, Mr. Jayaratne, we went to court alleging that certain actors, the former president, former finance ministers, central bank governors, all of them should be held accountable for the economic crisis that Sri Lanka has been struck by. Now, in this big case, I mean, it has huge implications. We have now received an order from the Supreme Court that's quite phenomenal, honestly, which has given leave to proceed on this case and which has asked those officials to answer for all of those key economic decisions made that led us down this path, including why the dollar was pegged at 203 rupees, why IMF assistance was not sought in time, why corporate tax breaks were given post the 2019 presidential election. So all of these are now before the Supreme Court, which is interesting because the Supreme Court has now asked the Auditor General and the Central Bank to answer to these questions and to communicate all decisions and recommendations made by the Monetary Board, the Central Bank, etc., on these issues prior to the 30th of November. Now, this is a phenomenal moment because it also ensures that the public has the potential to find out what really went on. We are actually inviting judicial oversight of these processes that are usually in the province of the executive. So there's a lot to look forward to there. The case is coming up again in January. But what we're really seeking here is accountability for the state that Sri Lanka is in. And the underlying cause for all of this really being corruption. So just speaking to what Bhavani requested at the beginning, which is reform, we need to really address the elephant in the room, which is about law enforcement in Sri Lanka. What is the point really of reform, say, at the constitutional level or at the legal level or policy level if we don't have law enforcement that we can depend upon? We saw in the past few, just in the past few years, few months also, that massive cases, really emblematic big corruption cases collapsing due to technical faults, due to supposed alleged lack of evidence. Now we know that when a prosecuting authority takes a case to court, the case presumably has passed the threshold of being a winnable case. that is why it is when a prosecuting authority has made that determination that they would go to court, that they would take a case to court. But then, don't we as the citizens have a legitimate expectation that the case should go on and not be discontinued for lack of evidence? So this raises serious questions as to whether these processes are being tampered with, whether these processes are actually being used in the best interest of the citizen. If cases are being withdrawn due to a technical error, which is valid, which flows from a 2018 decision of the Court of Appeal, then what is the delay in refiling these cases? Of course, we must acknowledge that we're dealing with a system that is heavily under-resourced and where expertise, deliberately or not, does not exist. We know that officials with the relevant expertise are not really kept in those relevant places. They're moved around. They're in the traffic police, if you will. So this is what's really happening. So this harks back to this point of state capture, right? So there are serious, crucial questions to be asked about law enforcement in the country. So in the absence of law enforcement, we again have this question of whether we can have trust in any kind of legislation or supposed reform that is being brought in, especially in context of GSP Plus, of the IMF director level agreement that we're talking about. So we need to be really cautious about even accepting reform willy-nilly, without careful scrutiny, without careful consideration and public debate. Now in this context, we know during the protest there was a huge call for the recovery of stolen assets to the country. This was being seen as a possible potential solution to the economic ills that we are undergoing, that, okay, we can bring back tons of dollars to the country in time to deal with the economic crisis. But this unfortunately cannot happen, especially in cases across the world where there has not been a big change of government. Asset recovery processes cannot or have not been initiated. And even where they have been initiated, because there is a need for the executive to initiate these actions, there is a high risk of re-corruption of any recovered assets. But also, we need to add to that fact that even where there is a compliant or a willing executive to initiate action, an asset recovery case would be extremely complicated, would need real experts to deal with it, to deal with the likes of the Department of Justice or the Serious Frauds Office in the UK, and then it can still take at least 10 years. So to the question of whether asset recovery can really solve our current problems, the answer is really no. And then we have other options to asset recovery. When we're talking about economic crime, the resolution referred to holding public officials, possibly, which seems to capture political actors as well, accountable. It is not going to be an easy process, especially when we're dealing with law enforcement that is unwilling, unable, incapable, or is all the way to the extreme of being tampered with. So we need to get this bit right if we're going to have accountability for corruption as an economic crime. In addition to that, we need to talk about the role of money in politics. We have a campaign, we don't have a campaign financing system in Sri Lanka. We have zero regulation on the acceptance or spending of campaign financing in elections at any level in Sri Lanka. So we don't know really who our politicians work for. Even the good ones can't prove themselves. I mean, this is why the Desiya Visipahama Epa call is coming from the public, because you have no way of distinguishing yourself from the corrupt ones either, unless there is mandatory disclosure of campaign financing where you receive the funding from, so the sources of funding, the amounts of funding, and the amount of expenses, and for what you're spending. Are you buying votes? Are you acting in the interests of others than your electors? So this is a huge elephant in the room that really dictates our politics today. And it also, within the party infrastructures, we're seeing that the power disparity plays out along the line of campaign financing as well. And that is an issue that needs to be addressed. So we are we know that there is an advanced draft of a campaign financing law, again, not open to the public yet. A final draft, given our opaque legislative system, is not in the public. So we know once these things are rushed through to Parliament or placed on the order paper of Parliament, you lose the ability to have a policy discussion. You completely are cut out of the process. So, and the same thing seems to be happening now with this proposed anti-corruption bill that seeks to replace the existing commission to investigate allegations of bribery and corruption law, the Bribery Act, and the Asset Declaration law. Now, this is the seminal piece of legislation that seeks to replace all of these things in a composite law. But we have received a draft, which we have now made public, but we are told that it has been sent, a draft has been sent to the Attorney General for his assent, which means there is very little chance when it comes back to the relevant ministry for public input, for expert input on these things. We know that until we made it public, several parties who have a keen interest in this kind of work had not even been consulted or had not had the opportunity to feed into this. So this piece of legislation, we are told, we saw in the papers over the weekend, that it's being rushed through. Why the rush is to create a facade, really, what it looks like. It is to create a facade of progress, of addressing corruption, but what we need now to address corruption is not necessarily new law. It's great that Sri Lanka wants to get its law in line with the UN Convention Against Corruption, but then we need to get it right. We can't pretend to do it while not doing it. So that is another key reform that's on the books. But I mean, no one in this room, I'm sure, wants to scuttle such a process. Nobody wants to scuttle such a process. It is just a matter of making sure that we get it right this time. Since 1994, if we are amending our bribery law for the first time, then we need to get it right. So that is also on the cards. So it also talks about this proposed legislation. I mean, it has a lot of good provisions. It talks about asset declaration reform. It talks about protection of whistleblowers to a certain extent, whistleblowers on corruption. It talks about empowering an independent commission to have greater powers to be able to hire investigators, multidisciplinary actors in order to carry out complex investigations. But the underpinning all of this are the constitutional amendments, the proposed constitutional council. If we don't have an independent constitutional council, how are we then to have an independent anti-corruption commission or whatever the formulation is going to be? So all of these go, unfortunately, hand in hand, and unless, as Daniel mentioned, we don't reduce or divorce the executive, or as much as possible reduce the powers of the executive in the carrying out of law enforcement, we cannot have accountability for anti-corruption. So when you look at the problem of corruption in this context, it is not going to be solved overnight. We cannot pretend to be able to solve it overnight. It is going to be long-term incremental reform, but we need to start now by putting the right frameworks in place, by not continuing to make the mistakes that we always have, by making sure we acknowledge corruption when it happens within our ranks, whether political, public sector, etc. If we are going in for constitutional reform or other reform, we need to make sure that we separate the executive from the public service, which also remains a huge issue since our current constitution came into play. There are also numerous other tools, PEP databases, beneficial ownership, politically exposed persons databases, beneficial ownership transparency, all of which needs to come into place in order to effectively address the corruption in this country, to effectively address illicit financial flows, and not only to address, but to prevent. And actors both in the private sector, the public sector, and the political sectors need to act together to do this, but also the citizens have a big role to play. I mean, we cannot be under any illusion that even those that engaged in the Aragale and the protests had a full or nuanced understanding of their level of complicity in the corruption that plagues the country today. So it's going to take a huge, multifaceted and long route to get to the end of corruption or the mitigation of corruption. But all of the steps need to be taken now, and we all, I think it's a long and arduous road where all of us need to be extra vigilant as, I mean, there's no rest, honestly, on fighting on every single front. But in the short term, I think litigation remains a recourse that needs to be taken as much as possible, questioning executive action, questioning powers that are, unduly used, the lack of due process. Litigation needs to be resorted to, but that also remains the province of those that are privileged, who have access to litigation lawyers, the ability to do that, and also the patience and the money to be able to carry that through to the end. So I'll end there, but I'm happy to answer any questions and discuss further. Thank you.
Thank you, Sangeeta. And I think it's a good reminder, both Daniel and Sangeeta connected to the challenges with governance. This is not a new issue, but also in terms of reforms, I think expectations, I mean, managing expectations, but also identifying what's possible. But the key aspect I think we need to keep in mind is the role of the citizen, and I think that's critical for us. Again, coming back to the point that we have seen quite unprecedented times, and also initiatives by individuals, many are in this room, and really challenging some of the practices and individuals. And the fact that the case you, Chandra, and others took on, I think is a reminder that public interest litigation, but other initiatives are so key to remind us that things are possible but may not work overnight. It just requires a lot of time. So let's go to Navam in terms of laying out the challenges in terms of foreign policy and what to look out for. And just again to say there are translations for anyone who requires Sinhala or Tamil translations. It's there, as well as for the live streaming that's happening for those who are unable to be in the room. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. So let me begin by actually echoing the point made by Daniel, Sangeeta, and Bhavan. There is an imbalance of power. And that imbalance is particularly problematic to a state, because when there is an imbalance of power caused by either the lack of legislative oversight or an politicized bureaucracy, it constrains the amount of feedback that decision makers get. And that's a problem, because when feedback is constrained, the ability of a state to accurately perceive its external environment or even its domestic environment is lost. And that limits the ability of a state to self-correct. So it might seem shocking that a state will wait till a country is literally broke and then wait for the whole economy to crash before it wakes up. But in a way, it's not too surprising, because what's been happening is that feedback has been constrained. The self-correction has not happened. And over the years or decades, in fact, that drift has led to much more serious consequences. And what I'd like to argue is that this lack of feedback, and as a result, the inability to accurately perceive the external environment, is not limited to the, to security or debt or corruption, but it also expands to foreign policy. It expands to foreign policy as well. And I'm going to argue that the Sri Lankan state, in its response to the UNHRC resolution, seems to have misperceived or actively misperceives what has happened. And as a result, we shouldn't be too optimistic of its ability to self-correct. So we begin by actually talking about the state's position on the UNHRC. After the resolution was passed, and in his statement, the foreign minister, Ali Sabri, argued that the resolution was unnecessary because of the various accomplishments he felt in the domestic stage on human rights and other areas. He also thought it was unjustified, claiming that the resolution violated the country's sovereignty or was unprecedented or went beyond the mandate of the UNHRC itself. And on that perception, the ministry has presented the results of the resolution as, in a sense, a defeat, as in a defeat to the sponsoring states, arguing that well over half the members either abstained or voted against it. That's its perception. So it doesn't even feel like it has actually been sanctioned or been condemned. And in a sense, it's true. Only like if you look at the full list, 40% of the countries voted for the resolution. But you see the states that actually made statements at that vote, of those countries, apart from Brazil, which seemed to use that term politicization and seem to accept that second argument about sovereignty, the other two very important abstaining countries, Japan and India, didn't accept either of those agreements. So, and of course, of the other countries that abstained, we don't really know why they abstained. So once you remove those countries that we don't know about, and then you kind of put Brazil in, you can leave Brazil, you can put Brazil to the set of countries that might be leaning towards, accepting the state's argument, you get a very different result. I mean, you could say close to about 70% of countries supported the resolution. So the state Sri Lanka has fundamentally misperceived the results itself. So there's a misperception of the procedures that have gone into it. And you can see that in the way it has spun this argument. The second broad manner in which the state has misperceived is, in addition to the procedure, the sponsoring states themselves. So it has misperceived the procedures, the results of the resolution and the votes. It has also seems to have misperceived the states that have sponsored this resolution. And that misperception covers three areas. The values of the sponsoring states, the power of these various groups of the sponsoring states or the states that voted in against and abstained, and also the motives of the various votes. So you can start with the values. The Sri Lankan, the foreign minister, and in subsequent press releases, constantly kept referring to the groups that either abstained or actively voted against the resolution as Sri Lanka's friends. And to me, this was a bit concerning, very concerning, in fact, because when you break down these countries, you can cut them and slice them in various ways. I decided to look at them in the context of democracy. Are they more democratic or less democratic? So, if your friends tell you, if a state's friends tell you a lot about that state, I think you're in trouble because the company you keep is not a very positive sign, clearly. And of course, I mean, this extends to also the power of these the sponsors. One more point on values. It's also important to note that the sponsoring states weren't necessarily as hostile as the Sri Lankan foreign ministry kind of described. But moving on to the power of these actors, the perception of the state is that these actors, the sponsoring states or the states that seem to align or support the resolution, aren't really a significant threat. Either they don't have the ability or the willingness to use power to kind of, produce carrots and sticks use them against Sri Lanka to influence the country. We can't really speak for the willingness to use, but we can kind of examine the capabilities of the different groups. And I took a few things that come to mind, and we can discuss them later as well. I looked at things like exports, especially the economic ability of these different groups, and that's on exports, foreign direct investment, and debt. And if you look at exports, over 75% of our exports go to countries that voted in favor of the resolution. That tells you a lot about economic interdependence. And in the long term, that's significant because these markets are not sources of, not just destination for your exports, but they're also important opportunities for networking and industrial upgrading and access to technology, all of which have really been brought forward to the limelight in this, the conflict with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, for instance. In another domain, that's foreign direct investment, again, countries that voted in favor or leaned closer towards the resolution do have, account for, again, close to about a little over half, about 60% of foreign direct investment. It's only in debt, in the context of debt, that the countries that voted against the country, or against the resolution, account for, in a sense, have disproportionate power, and that's because China is in that group. So, in the long term, it seems that the state has misperceived the values of the sponsoring states. It has also misperceived the ability of these states to produce or influence Sri Lanka in the long term, or to kind of use that power, regardless of whether they're willing to do it. And in a third way that they're misperceived sponsors is this focus on diasporas. In every conversation you hear about the ministry's response to the resolution, one consistent claim is that somehow this is the work of diasporas. But the truth is, if you look at the diaspora populations of Sri Lankans in these key sponsoring states, like the United States, the United Kingdom, for instance, there are, yes, a little of less than about 100,000 in both countries, a little more than that in the UK, and a little less than that in the US. And these are total migrants, Sinhalese, Tamils, and all of that. A fraction of the population, less than 0.1% of the combined population of these, 0.01% of these, of the combined populations of these countries. As far as we know, there aren't any, Tamil diaspora lawmakers or large lobby groups in these countries. So what that tells us is that the motive to vote for this resolution cannot just be dismissed as some sort of diaspora conspiracy. That's a dangerous misperception from a foreign policy point of view, because if it is, you can just hope that pressure kind of dissipates over time. But if it's based on something more concrete, it's not going to go away anytime soon, and it wouldn't. So it's probably based on something more concrete, like values, or that's important, and the state has misperceived. So you take this misperception of the vote itself, the misperception of the sponsoring states, their values, their motives, and of course their ability to implement the kind of decisions that they've talked about since the vote. And the opportunity, or the kind of optimism you would have for self-correction, at least in terms of foreign policy, and also obviously by extension in domestic policy, is quite limited. There's little reason to be optimistic if you don't even believe you lost, or that somehow your position came out on top. So the consequences in the long term, again, I can't speak for what countries will do, except for what they're capable of doing, but in the context of this broader conversation of autocracies versus democracies, it's highly likely that we're going to see additional efforts to impose smart sanctions, very much on the likes that were already in place. The conversation seems to try and remove the state, Sri Lanka, from certain ruling party elites and kind of prioritize them for smart sanctions. How effective that is going to be is quite questionable because of the limited sort of investments or interdependence in those markets that we know of. But of course we wouldn't, because the system is so opaque, we can't even tell how dependent they are. But I doubt it'll be as effective. But on a more serious note, there is the problem of bandwidth, because even if this doesn't do any real material damage to elites in the country or foreign policy personnel, it does sap bandwidth. The ability of the government to focus on anything but these sort of resolutions. And so putting all of that into together, and I'll be happy to take questions afterwards, I think the space for self-correction, the space for actually kind of coming back into compliance with these international obligations is not, certainly there's little reason to be optimistic, and that's worrying. And we are not seeing any hints or indications that that's going to change. And I think that will obviously play or be taken into account sponsors in the next few months and years in the UNHRC. All right, thank you.
Thanks, Nawam, and I think quite sobering in terms of the international processes that we are confronted with, including, I mean, I forgot to mention, the resolution itself speaks about reporting back, which the first reporting back is in June, and I think that's something to look to in terms of how the government, if the government is genuinely interested, what is it that they're going to report back in June? But also with the other processes, the IMF, there is the EU, the GSP Plus process that's also happening. I mean, these are all interconnected in terms of the issues of human rights, corruption, labor, environment. I mean, there's a whole host of issues that we need to look at, and how the government really engages within Sri Lanka, but also internationally. There's quite a lot of issues that have been raised. I mean, I'm not even going to attempt to cover all of it, but I would like to open it up to discussion from the audience here, but also those who are connecting virtually. In terms of some of the broad areas that came about was like the whole issue of governance. I mean, the model of governance of the executive-heavy model that we're confronted with, but this moment of potential reforms. I mean, what are the reforms that we can look at in terms of legislative reform, but also structural reforms? But reforms alone won't fix the problems we are confronted with. But also in terms of lawmaking, and this is a point Sankita raised, but also something we've been talking about, our lawmaking process in itself is problematic. As citizens, and the parliamentarians can speak to their own experience, but as citizens, we only have a few days, a small window to challenge legislation. And then it's really committee stage amendments. And I think some of us who've been engaging with this process knows how committee stage amendments also are hugely problematic. So really in terms of reforms, that scrutiny, eternal vigilance is required from citizens, civil society and other stakeholders. But in terms of also accountability, what is it that we are looking at? I mean, we talk about impunity, but those problems also remain in terms of the actors, and how do we fix those issues as well? So there's a whole lot of areas of reform, but action that can be done using the state structures, the processes we have. But I also want to kind of bring it back to this particular moment and how we got here, but also the windows, and many actually, I think, who are kind of looking to some kind of good news, say, what is it that we are looking at? And I also want to say this, that maybe earlier this year we wouldn't have even thought regime change the way it happened would have happened. That thousands of people went to the streets, largely peacefully protesting. That also can be discussed. But there was change brought. I mean, of course, it didn't go all the way, and that's where we are now. And there is that frustration. What is it that's possible? This whole issue of elections, all of these things are now in the public domain. But we did manage to see some change. So I think what we should try to look to now is what is it that we can do in the next couple of months, next couple of years. There are different stakeholders here, from members of parliament, to civil society, to the international community, to election monitors, and those who've been really at it on the ground, who've been really protesting and really calling for system change. Some in the room have been arrested for what they've been doing in terms of their activism. So really kind of opening it up now to hear from individuals or asking questions from the panel as to what's possible, but also in terms of reforms. We've been having some of these debates for a while, campaign finance, the central bank, some of the human rights issues. So what is it realistically that's possible? And also to be very upfront, this is the first of a series of discussions we hope to take forward. Some who couldn't join today, who are out of Colombo, we'd like to engage in those areas. It's very much, I realize these are Colombo-centric conversations. So it's also important to go out to the people in the areas also to have this discussion. So ideas about taking this forward also is welcome. And again, identifying also things that others could do. I mean, we did invite the government as well. I'll be very upfront. We did invite the Foreign Ministry and other stakeholders. Some did show interest, but I don't think anyone's in the room here, unfortunately. So it's engaging with the state, with the government, with the different stakeholders that's also critical. So does anyone have any ideas, questions, comments? And please, there are mics. Please identify yourself when you are speaking, because some who are joining virtually may not see you as well. So who would like to start? It's always hard to get someone to speak. I'm going to ask questions then of some of the individuals in the room, but does anyone have thoughts, disagreements from what was raised? Yes, yes. So there will be a roaming mic. If not, I will ask some questions of particular participants. Saku, yes. And Saku, could you introduce yourself as well?
Put you out of your misery, Bhavani. I'm Sakuntala Kadirgama. First of all, we've talked about this reform for so long. I think people have got disillusioned and disenchanted. I think the Aragalaya brought a kind of intensity, urgency, and different people making those demands. And so that was perhaps the reason why people were so optimistic. In fact, my organization, we've been documenting what we call a people's parliament, because ordinary people had very clear ideas about what should be done. And there is an energy which we should bring back into this debate, and we'll talk about that later. But you see, I mean, Daniel spoke about the institutions, anti-corruption bodies, all that is great, but it also depends on who's in those bodies, right? You can either subvert those institutions while you're there, or just be passive as placeholders, and then nothing will happen. So there really has to be a culture of citizens wanting and demanding this kind of change. And I think that is very important. I mean, and to make sure that you build, you know, I mean, 2015, we had an optimistic moment. We thought there would be Yahapalana, good governance. Then that flipped in the next cycle. Then we had the kind of government, and they were kicked out, and you know, then again you thought there was energy. So we keep yo-yoing between a desire for good governance and majoritarian nationalism. So, you know, we really, how are we going to build on this change? And that's what I think is important. And maybe we're looking at the wrong people from whom that change is going to come from.
Anyone else? It could be a question to the panelists or anyone else in the room.
Hi, Jovita Arulanandam from the British High Commission. Just to maybe challenge you, the last speak on one of the points you made about the misinterpretation of the result. So I think in terms of the government's sort of response to previous resolutions have always been that. That was the narrative I think that they've tried to push. Because I'm speaking through a mask. Now is it on now? Okay. Yeah. So this is Jovita from the British High Commission. And the sort of point you made around the sort of result and its misinterpretation. What I've sort of seen it as is been like, I think on previous resolutions, they've also reacted similarly. And I think it's not a misinterpretation, but that's a narrative they think the public would buy, and it's something that they want to sort of sell to the public. But interestingly, I think this time I was sort of surprised that they did the same thing when the public were sort of less interested in that, as in there was less sort of appetite for that kind of thing, or that kind of thing where they're pushing out as of conspiracy theories and this is sold by the diaspora. So I think if in everything that has happened, that one positive thing was there are certain aspects of the resolution, bits of the reform where they've always used the excuse that, okay, where we can't do this because it's like the public will react on this, like little bits of like the sort of say OMP, like, you know, military families, we can't push certain things through, but now there is less of an appetite for that kind of narrative to be sold. So I think that is a bit in terms of like where, like if you're looking for something positive, that's something. So that's all.
This is from the chair and the panel. I'm Dr. Laksari Mendis. There are many deficiencies and gaps in many countries, developing countries, in relation to implementation of international norms and standards. I have been working in different countries. They do have the same problems, either implementing the UN Convention or human rights. There are gaps, a lot of gaps, but they are not so much focused in the international, arena. They pass by somehow without much notice. In your opinion, from the panel, chair and the participants, what makes Sri Lanka very much different from the others? What makes it different in the implementation of these standards? Is it the constitutional structure? Is it something else? Or what makes, or is the legislative techniques? We are not using the good techniques, which I will tell you, because we have evolved in my career as a United Nations legal expert. I have done a lot of techniques which are not found in Sri Lankan's legislative system. But whereas they do have that advantage over us, because they are interacting with the developed world and want to top schools in Harvard or Cambridge, where they develop these structures. But is it that, or what is actually wrong in your opinion? 2 or 3 points to convince me further. Can you? That's my question to you.
Hi, I'm Thamindri from SEPA. My question is for Namam. This is more of a question than I just wanted to add to what Jovita was saying about the misperception. I think there's a danger in identifying it as a misperception, because I agree with her that I don't think they're misguided or misperceived. I think there's a difference between misunderstanding a situation and propaganda, and I think it's important that we identify for what it is, because otherwise we remove part of accountability from those perpetuating these myths as well. Just wanted to clarify that.
Or shall we get the... okay, sorry.
Not a question so much as we talk a lot about reforms. Sorry, I'm Roshan Pereira, independent consultant. We talk a lot about reforms, but if you have seen in the last few days, since the Inland Revenue Bill was put out, the backlash from so-called, educated people as well about paying taxes, you realize, we need to put our mouth where our actions really where because we ask for reform, but we're not willing to undertake the tough, to feel the pain of the reforms. And I think we've all failed in that, because we've not really educated the public on what reforms really mean. So even during the Argalaya or after that, even with the fuel price subsidy, removal of the fuel price subsidies, the backlash that the government faced really, but really that is part of the reform process. So how do we as the civil society educate people on what reforms should be? Because we want, as Dr. Sarmurthy said, we all want a kind of a, so government to protect us or to subsidize or give a sort of universal subsidy from cradle to grave, or a social security system that is operated in the Nordic countries, but we're not willing to pay for it. We want to, have it, but is that something sustainable? We know it's not sustainable. So that's just a question, and I think we need to try to address that, because I think that's an important point.
I think I just want to add a little bit more to what Roshan said. I think when you look around, we talk all the time about rights. Nobody's talking about the responsibilities that citizens have, and I think that ties to what Roshan said. And I think the same as what Sarah and Roshan said, in the citizenry, there is a sense of entitlement of the rights with no thought of the responsibilities, whether it's, expecting this without paying our taxes, whether, everything becomes a freebie, patronage, blah, blah, blah. And also what I saw during the Aragalaya time was, even, and pardon the few politicians who are thinkers who are here, even among the political parties, there was a crisis in the country. People of all diversities got together asking for change. And it was change against this one regime. Even at that time, the opposition parties just could not get their act together to forget their differences and stand as one voice. And now we have ended up with a president who came in all by his little self with no support from anybody else. That is causing problems. So in Parliament, it was unbelievable that they could not stand behind a set of mics and talk as one voice. There's one party that I thought was very professional. One of them is here. They are small, so they were not fighting, thinking about the next election. So this sense of entitlement and no sense of your responsibility, I think unless that changes, there's no hope, And even now, maybe partly the whole Aragalaya, the power of that Aragalaya has got lost, partly because now the government is coming down hard after all the nonsense they did with the violence, breaking down everything there. But also, I think part of it is the fact that people now have fuel, they have cooking gas, they have more electricity than they did. So the immediate problem is over. So I think unless that mindset of the need for, real change gets away from the sense of entitlement, I don't think we'll go anywhere. We finally get the leaders that we put there, no? So, I don't know.
Thank you, Anila, for maybe putting some pressure
I just have
on
a short question.
the politicians in the room. But, sorry, one question and then Sarah, and then we come back.
A technical question here. I'm Kaushalya from Equal Ground. My question is, we mentioned about the evidence gathering mechanism. I just wanted to ask maybe the audience or the panelists, what does this mean for Sri Lanka in terms of independence, then sovereignty? What are we up for? That's my question. Thank you.
Sarah, you wanted to?
At the end of the day, what I suppose we all really want to hear is how do we get out of this terrible crisis that we are in. Now, the way I see it, as Sankita said, the corruption issue, there is no quick fix. That's going to take probably 10 years, maybe 15, and then also we may even only get 10% back or whatever, And there are other issues too, which are going to take one hell of a lot of time. The Aragalaya is not given to the idea of patience. The Aragalaya wants things fast. They may not have an idea as to how to do it, but they want things fast. Now, given the circumstances of the current government and of the president, if Ranil Wickremesinghe was to get up and say, look, all of these things that we're talking about, I support, but please understand, they're going to take at least a decade to accomplish. Everyone is going to laugh him out of court, because they would say that, look, here is the dictator, here's the one who wants to postpone elections, here's the one who wants to grab onto power, all of those kinds of things. So I want to ask the panel, and indeed, given that we have a diverse and distinguished audience here, don't you think that one of the first things that we have to do is to get a very definite timetable with regard to elections? And that as far as those elections are concerned, we need a political party or a coalition of political parties to get up and tell the people, look, this money that the Rajapaksas allegedly have stolen are not going to come back day after tomorrow. It's going to take one hell of a long time to bring it back. Finding evidence with regard to holding Gotabaya Rajapaksa accountable, or Mahinda Rajapaksa, or Basil Rajapaksa, or whoever the hell it is going to be, is also going to take time, if we have the political will and the commitment. Who is going to tell them the truth with regard to it? Who is also going to say to them, look, we have to cut the public service. There are going to be winners and losers. Yeah? Some people will have to suffer because at the end of the day, we allowed ourselves for this to happen to us. As someone said, yes, it is about our responsibility as well. So what is the political, who is the political party, which is the political party, or what is the political coalition that is today willing to get up and tell the people the truth? And the truth is, like with regard to the whole questions of war crimes and the allegations of violations of international humanitarian law and all of that, the truth is about recovery. That it is going to take time and a lot of effort. And we need that at the next election, because that can only happen if it is underpinned by legitimacy. And that legitimacy can only come with a general election.
Okay, so we'll get to the panel and then do another round of questions. I think Sarah has opened up everyone wanting to respond. So let's start with Sankita.
Just quickly to respond to that last thought by Dr. Sarvanmuthu, I think while fully acknowledging that it takes time, what we need is politicians and whoever is communicating to the public to stop taking the wrong steps and start taking the right ones now, right? So if that happens, perhaps this patience can come from the public. If there is a clear communication about what to expect. Even with the tax reform, the difficulty is, I mean, it partly stems from the economic crisis and all of that, but it's from not knowing that you are going to be slapped with this, right? So if you know that you're in for the long haul, and that is accompanied, that is communicated to you, but it is accompanied by the proper tone from the top, the correct actions being taken, and faith being rebuilt, the trust deficit that has rent, the public and its representatives can begin to be restored. In the absence of that, I think you can't necessarily ask for patience, but absolutely, elections are needed for legitimacy, and elections can't be postponed because of so-called stability. Just to quickly respond to why these processes, international processes, put so much attention on Sri Lanka. I will not speak to the politics of it, but one key reason is all of these human rights abusers, international law violations, the corruption abuses that are being talked about have very real, visible consequences to the average citizen in Sri Lanka, to certain factions of the citizenry. Therefore, it becomes so much more visible, and it is needed that there should be international attention on that. I will stop at that, because the impact is felt like every day, every moment. We are all suffering from the consequences of it. So irrespective of the politics and the power dynamics of the international community, I think it's important that this attention continues to be given locally and wherever possible, so that those issues might be addressed in whatever forum possible.
Thank you. So this is my, in response to those two questions, I mean, let me clarify. That's my mistake. It's a bit of a jar. Misperception, I really hope I didn't give anyone the impression that it's mistaken, it's accidental. I mean, misperception can be caused by, it can be accidental when you don't have proper information about something and, you just misperceive. But misperception is also is an outcome of your belief system, of your political system, about the incentives that are in place, right? I mean, for example, a very quick example is like when COVID came about, you had people who were dunking themselves in manure and urine in India as a kind of a form of a protection against COVID. Now, that was a misperception because that's not how viruses work. You can't ward off a virus by through those kind of practices or drinking, throwing spirit water into a lake or something like that. But it was completely consistent with those people's belief systems. So in the case of the Sri Lankan state, yes, it has misperceived. It has completely, it's arguing that the votes that it has actually won, or it's not as significant, or the sponsors aren't as serious, or don't have our best interests in heart. Yeah, sure. But that misperception is not accidental. It's very much a product of the political incentives in place. So in that sense, I hope I completely agree with both points. This has been, it's a consistent thing. It's a claim that has been made consistently, but that the result is misperception, but it's deliberate. It's an outcome of this particular set of institutions. So that's my clarification for that. Anything you want to add?
So I think the premise which seems to dominate a lot of conversation in this room and outside this room as well is that corruption is really what we need to worry about. It is the cause of this crisis. It is the cause of the state of this country. Corruption is the root ill. In my view, I fear incompetent politicians and incompetent policymakers much more than corrupt ones. If you look at the proximate causes for this crisis, the tax cuts, intermediate ones, like the pile-up of sovereign debt spent on wasteful infrastructure, spent on the expansion of the public service, the military, et cetera, or longer-term causes like the failure to continue the reform momentum that existed between 1977 and roughly 2005 in terms of trade, in terms of significantly increasing tariffs, in terms of a whole range of other rigidities in the economy. These all seem to be driven primarily by incompetence rather than corruption, in the sense that, let's take as a thought experiment, if an additional terminal had been put at the Bandaranaike International Airport, that would probably generate as big a return as the Mattala Airport with an equal-sized commission. So the private incentives are the same, but the public welfare implications are significantly different. And I think you see this throughout the economic story. And solving the corruption problem is not going to solve that. And I think that's really something that is going to be important for people to understand if we are to identify those we need to vote for, those we need to put in places of responsibility.
Thanks. There was a very specific question on the evidence gathering, and I'll just very briefly comment that this was something brought in by the resolution last year. And what happened this year was just an extension for 2 years, and the evidence gathering it's a specific project based in Geneva, based in the High Commissioner's office, and it's to, and the resolution very specifically says preserve, analyze and preserve evidence for future processes. And this is something that we can discuss more, but it's very much reflected in the resolution as what's happening. But it's not something that started this year. I just want to be very clear. It started last year, and it's part of the it sits within the High Commissioner's office, but it's a very specific project. I just also want to very much comment in terms of everyone spoke to the main issues, but there's also parliamentarians in the room who could speak to some of the things that are also maybe not publicly known in terms of what's happening with the committees, some of the discussions even this year about elections, calling for elections, and opposition coming together maybe on certain things, but also maybe private members' bills. Those are, I think, some things we can talk about. But there's also Roshan's point about awareness. I mean, some from the media are here as well, but also it's not just the mainstream media, it's also the role of social media in engaging and putting out ideas. One of the things we have been confronted with is just the lack of information out there in terms of, and this is a challenge we face. Many people say, don't produce all these long reports, we want something simple, we want something visual. I mean, that's a challenge. People don't want to read. People want something very quick. So, and that's a challenge we face, because the young people will say, what is this, you're writing all these reports, no one's going to read. But in terms of some of the ideas, reforms, engagement, if there are new things we can do or others can do, this is also time to engage as well. But I just fear this moment that people are going to get more and more disappointed, but also in the face, and let's be very clear, there is a food crisis, there is malnutrition, there is this challenge of getting medicines, and people are likely to get on the streets again. So we are going to face further hardship. So what is it that we do beyond the reforms as well? So we'll come back to another round of comments, questions. I've already seen one hand up. Mr. Suman.
I'm Swandiran. I probably want to reflect on comments made by the two ex-central bankers. And ask the question about the opposition parties not coming together or speaking in one voice. Actually, we must remind ourselves that around May or middle of May or early May, the opposition parties did arrive at one single point, and that was enunciated by the Bar Association's proposal, which they call the national program. The actual opposition parties, all three of them, agreed on that there must be a time frame for the abolition of executive presidency. It must be announced by President Gotabaya Rajapaksa. That bill must go through Parliament within a specified time, and then another 6 months or whatever, or year, I think Bar Association said, times can vary, that a referendum should be held, and elections also should be held, Parliament elections. All agreed on that. Unfortunately, one single MP, who was only MP from his party, sneaked through the back door and changed that whole scenario. So that's what happened. By and large, the opposition was agreed on the national program, and not just something that we ourselves did it, but with the Bar Association as well. Right now, I mean, no point talking about that, but now, how do we move forward? Because if we had done that, then the Aragalaya could have actually been taken forward. But now we are back to square one with the same people in office. Right? No change whatever. So although the Prime Minister resigned, although the President fled and resigned, they are all the same people who are still in office. Right? So I think that is where the slip was. I have no answers now. We need to put our heads together and work. And election is one thing that I think we must all agitate for and somehow get it. This Roshan's point about the taxes again, the point is not that people are unwilling to pay taxes, but this ad hoc way of sudden imposition, right, or change. There must be a policy. Now that the matter is out in the open, even Parliamentary Committee on Public Finance that Harsha heads, should have been consulted, a policy prepared without suddenly slapping this. They may be just 1% of the top bracket or whatever, but the implications of that are far-reaching. Young professionals are wanting to leave the country when they are told that out of 300, if you make 350,000, you pay 50,000 tax, right? That's so. A lot of those. I'm not saying that shouldn't be. That could have been the outcome, but what was the process of arriving at a taxation policy? We do have institutions. We do have parliamentary committees. Others, experts. But sudden, imposition of this kind of thing is the problem, not the issue itself. So I think those are two comments I want to make. Also,
yes.
Can I just add one about the evidence gathering mechanism? That is a process by which people who have violated international criminal law, the evidences are gathered and kept in a file. So if they do travel to countries that exercise universal jurisdiction, sometimes if work has been done properly, prosecution ready file can be given to that country to prosecute that person. That is because we have not taken accountability seriously. We have not taken prosecution of offenders in our own jurisdiction, and we have lived in denial all these years.
There's one question here, and if anyone else. Also, you can ask questions in Sinhala and Tamil as well, translation.
In English, huh? I speak in English. My question is a response to Dr. Savramuthu and Sangika. I was there in Vienna at the time these two conventions were negotiated and concluded. That is transnational organized crime and Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties. The two conventions were negotiated during the time, and I was the head of delegation for Sri Lanka. And we took almost 6 months to conclude the negotiations. There is a toolkit in that, and there were very many ambassadors who spoke very eloquently on this. And some did predict, now 22 years have gone, that it will never be implemented because these resolutions is worthwhile reading for you. I can give it to you if you like to. It is said that unless you share the spoil with those countries or offshore financial centers, they will never disclose these assets which are lying abroad. And these were ambassadors. I can give you the names. And they laugh this whole process. And that asset recovery committee was chaired by Srinivasan, Indian man. And he was more interested in the politics. And he said, you chair it, now I'm off. So I began to realize that that is true. Unless it is the golden egg that hen lays, in these offshore centers, they are not going to disclose to you. So unless you enter into an arrangement, it will not take 10 years, it will take very few years to get the information. Until you do this, we are just against a blank wall, I must tell you. Because I have worked in offshore centers, I know how they react to these requests. They just throw it under the carpet, that's all they do. Thank you.
Anila, and then Sankita wants to respond, and maybe while Harsha and Irana are also in the room, to hear from you also some thoughts.
Do I go? Yeah. This is actually a question to the legislators and to the people on the legal system and the laws. So pardon me if I go back a little in history. Now I know about government budgets because it's been in, the situation has been so bad for so long. In, I think, 2001, the Fiscal Management Responsibility Act came in because a new government came in, and we can't mention names, found that the Secretary of the Treasury had hidden a lot of debt that not even the central bank knew about. So the FMRA came in to hold the Finance Ministry accountable for public finances. And then governments changed, and the same person came back and made a mockery of that act. There was no accountability under the FMRA. Then along comes another government, I think it was a similar prime minister, and we had all these problems because budgets were never monitored. A budget speech and a budget is presented in November. Nothing happened in Parliament till the following budget. Then the budget is presented. The previous budget, which has failed, is not analyzed. So they brought in the Committee on Public Finance Act. And that was, I thought it was a very good idea, to make Parliament accountable once it passes the budget to monitor the budget monitoring. We were also involved, and I can say the chairman of the first committee is here, and my greatest respect for him. But then I, as an outsider, we were called in as experts to support, found that Parliament has, I think, 16 members on any of these committees. And about 6 take it seriously, and they don't even come for the meetings. They don't know, they are ignorant, they have never bothered to study the subject. So all, I don't know about COPE, I've heard stories about COPE because I had a sibling who was on those. I think all these on paper, these acts are excellent, but in practice, if the legislators of the country don't take their job seriously, I mean, it's a struggle. I think we can ask these committee chairmen how difficult it is for them to function. The following, some years later, I was asked, I had criticized the budget, 2020 budget. And I went for CEO, the meeting, and I could not. Harsha and Suma were there. I mean, I thought it was surreal. It was, the Secretary of the Treasury lied to the committee. The committee members didn't even understand they were being lied to. This is a committee on public finance. One member was asking about organic fertilizer in the middle of the Committee on Public Finance meeting. I mean, it's really tragic. So the one thing is, having a law is useless if the people who are to implement it don't take it seriously. The second is other laws. Now, for example, you used, what is the new one that's coming on corruption? You know, there are laws in this country that are already there. If people are not implementing the laws correctly, bringing in a new law for people to again not implement makes absolutely no sense. Other areas, the labor laws, they are so archaic. You know, during the, I think it was the avant-garde case or something, and I was talking to a very senior lawyer, and I said, what on earth is happening? And she told me, you know, our laws are so archaic, there is no statute under which we know what they're, I can't remember, I shouldn't use the word avant-garde because I know who it was. It was something to do with the government. They were obviously doing something illegal. And there was, she said, there's no statute under which to charge. And if you look at labor laws, they are so archaic, the private sector goes around. If you look at, I mean, look at the case of the Express Pearl. What is happening? The government should be getting compensation. So my bottom line is, passing laws. And then the legal draftsman's department seems to have very little capacity, because if you read those laws, they are really badly drafted. So the question is, unless people are serious about using those laws, bringing in new laws and more new laws is utterly useless unless there's a commitment. And looking at the other sectors of this economy, I mean, Daniel is right. I don't think it's corruption, it's incompetence, and it is a lack of accountability. So in all sectors of this economy, lots of the laws are so archaic, they should be looked at and they should be revised. But if you already have a bribery commission thing, you don't need to bring another one on corruption and combine it. Even the MLA, the new MLA, is a good thing, but if the people behind it are not going to be accountable, bringing in a new MLA to make the central bank independent is not going to achieve it if the people there are going to be, puppets. So this bringing in new laws and not looking at what we have and improving them, bringing in new institutions without addressing the problems in the existing institutions when we already have a bloated public service. These are areas the citizens we have to raise. There are, by the way, there are 70 government institutions that look over agriculture, which is the lowest growing, least productive sector. There are 100 overlooking industry, and we can see how industry has grown. Half these institutions can be closed, Then who's looking at the big picture? So I think some of these citizens have to take up at a more serious level. Thanks.
Thanks, Anila. I know there is 2 other members of parliament who play key roles in terms of accountability, scrutiny in parliament. Would you like to share any thoughts? Respond to any comments?
Thank you. So many things were said, so can't respond to everything that was said. I think I will re-emphasize Daniel's point. Definitely, the mess we are in, the primary reason is not corruption. I came from civil society and the private sector and went into politics. It's incompetency and it's really wrong policies. No question about it. We can measure the corruption, can be measured. Certainly, we have to go after it. And the answer to what you said is, I think we should go after it not because of what we will recover. We should go after it because we should punish those who actually were involved in corruption. One. Second is, it should become a deterrent for others who are actually coming into it for that reason. Unlike 20, 30 years ago, there are quicker methods now, and I won't get into the details of actually pursuing that, not like the time of Pinochet or something. You can do it much, much faster now, and there are shortcuts and short methods. So I think for that reason, we should go after it. The other thing is the focus often is on, we know everything that's wrong in this country and this parliament will fix it. Absolute nonsense. Parliament can't fix it. Dr. Anila just said that, there were loans taken by the Ministry of Finance, right, and they hid it or whatever like that. And I'm shocked that the central bank didn't know about it. So, right, I'm just pointing that as an example that the central bank should have obviously known about it, right? Or they either hid it or it was incompetence. So incompetence is not only in parliament, there's incompetence all around. If you look at the judicial system in the country, what's it got to do with parliamentarians? Whether it's instituting cases, whether it is withdrawing cases, whether it's, or the judiciary deciding on it, right? That's nothing to do with parliamentarians. They have to act independently. Professionals have to stand up wherever they may be. They have to stand up, right? And I think this thing about, fixing it on parliament will never get this country right. I opened my eyes when I was helping a parliamentarian when I was a banker, and I was helping him privately as an advisor, and one day he turned to me and said, he looked at me annoyed because I go and complain, because I'm a civil society person, I go and say this, that, and the other, and he looked at me and he said this comment to me. He said, Iran, we have been working together for 2.5 years. You still haven't understood something. I said, what haven't I understood? You haven't understood that this system works for those of us who are in it. That day I went home and I opened my eyes, right? And I stopped complaining, because if we are really going to put the system right, that's why I'm all with the Aragalaya and with the aspirations of the Aragalaya. For that reason, I'm with the aspirations of the Aragalaya, not with all the Aragalaya people, but with the aspirations of it for that reason. So we have to all, and I might say this, going from the private sector into parliament. We can talk about incompetence there, unless people are willing to cross from civil society and the private sector, and so actually go into parliament. You need a critical number. There is no question about it. You can't change it. I believe that people are more important than policy, because if you have the right people, eventually, policies we might differ, we might argue, we can amend them and all. But if you don't have the right people, you just can't. And you need a critical number in there. This Varaprasada of MP, just forget about it. There is no Varaprasada. I carry my payslip around. If anybody is interested, it's in my car. I will give you a copy. Right? It's nonsense. What we are really, it is that people who are stealing and robbing and abusing, it's not what it's because a private sector person, corporate person can't come in and support a family. It's impossible to do that unless you have private wealth. Otherwise, you get caught up in corruption also, you see, and that's the way the system works. I'm saying that because everybody doesn't say that, because the other narrative is what's often said, right? And we need to really look at changing that also. And then I will say, some of these changes will take time. That doesn't mean that we should stop working at it. I liked what Sarah said. He says, Aragalaya wants everything immediately, but the reality is everything can't be done immediately within the democratic framework. In other ways you may be able to, but not within the democratic framework. And therefore we just can't give up. We have to go that route. Constitutional changes, etc., etc. The more fundamental things, right? Because we're talking of policy, the country has been ruined, as Daniel said, with the competence of people, but because of policy, right from the beginning, and from language to inclusiveness to equality, you name it. It's not the economy. The economy just floundered finally. And unless we correct those, with the discussion on the present crisis doesn't solve Sri Lanka's fundamental problems. So I think I would like to keep that on the table, because we are economists, financial people, we are always looking at that and talking about that. But it doesn't solve Sri Lanka's fundamental issues. We have to go back there. Thank you.
Harsha? Okay.
Thanks. It's not just incompetence, Daniel. I mean, people who are there, it's just that I think it's misplaced incentives. Misplaced incentives, right? And it cannot be the incompetence of the politician. I mean, either it has to be the incompetence of the officials who advise the politician, or it is the misplaced incentives of both the politician and the official. You see, now for instance, taxes. I recall, Anila, we were there. I was a member of the committee. And the Secretary of the Treasury lied for hours. And then the committee just took it. And she was aghast. And at the end of the meeting, she came up to me and said, Harsha, how can we? And then we saw what happened, right? So it is not the incompetence of those treasury people. They're very competent people. I mean, they have PhDs in economics. So how can they be incompetent? They're not incompetent. It's just, they're either they're backboneless people or are part of a corrupt structure that benefits all of these people. So I do agree that parliamentarians need to, learn a little bit more about economics. That's why we started this program, and they have taken a privilege issue against me, and they want to sack me because I want to teach them economics. I mean, this is crazy. Roshan was one of the people who spoke, and it was the central bank, it was the treasury, and people who participated thought it was a very good session, and I'm not going to be, threatened by these allegations, quote unquote. And we are going to go ahead with the third session of the series next week, and I'm taking them on, right? So there has to be some sort of understanding of how the economy works, but I don't necessarily put the blame on the politicians' incompetence. It's the whole structure. I mean, Lakshman, Professor Lakshman, are you telling me that Professor Lakshman is incompetent? Right? I mean, why do you make him governor? Right? I mean, so are you telling me the entire central bank is incompetent? They're the same people who are telling us different things today. The same people, nobody's changed. Who was there from 2019 to 2022 are the same people who are here from 2022 whenever on. And they're singing off a different hymn sheet. So why are you blaming the politician? Right? So there's a structural, there's a fundamental problem in our system. Right? So that's the point I want to make. I think we really have to address the issue there. But I want to make one point about what Roshan and Anila both said about taxes. Yes, we need to increase taxes. That's well known. But on the one hand, you're giving tax breaks to companies for 17 years. Later that week, they are jacking up taxes on the same industry from 0 to 30. You tell me how that is fair? The same week. And then you're going from, personal income taxes going to 36%. There's no deductible after April, right? For the first 6 months, this 6 months, there's some deductible, I think 500,000 or some small amount. But what is for a person, for a salary, for a family of 4 people, poverty is probably will be end of this month, about 70,000 rupees, okay? Poverty level. It was 60,000 in July. August, 60,000 in August. And with inflation now at 70%, I'm saying, look, it might be 70,000. So what is 100,000 rupees? This is just to survive. Anila's poverty line. 2,100 or less kilocalories a day, right? So, you can't strangulate a person, right? So what I'm saying is, I'm not disagreeing with Roshan or Anila or anyone else that we need to increase revenue to the state, but it has to be done in a way that you don't, just completely wipe out the person in the process.
So just a clarification of the taxes. Someone who's earning 100,000 will pay something like 600 rupees. So that's not, it immediately jumps up. That's just that part. But I want to make one more point about, I think leadership really matters. Harsha brought the point about the central bank. Just see how the policies change from Indrajit Kumaraswamy to the next governor and the current governor. So I think leadership really matters, and I think that's what we'll be talking about, from the executive right down to even institutions. How do we get good leadership?
Okay, I'm very aware it's past 7 o'clock and it's a Friday evening. I don't want to be the reason for your keeping you away from your revelry. So If there are one final comment, we will come back to the panel, and you can, of course, stay back and have conversations, but I think one more. Okay, one final, sorry. Okay, two women, very strong women, need to talk, so they have the final word, and then it's
just a little question. I've been just thinking about this resolution, and by the way, I'm Minna Tahir. I'm getting a bit scared. I mean, we had one resolution already, 30/1. I wonder if we reflected on that sufficiently enough, and now we have another one. Is there going to be any connectivity, any kind of continuity from where the work stopped with 30/1? And you know, and there they underscored on reconciliation, and here economic crisis is being underscored. So I really don't know what these things would actually mean to people on the ground, and whether there will actually be meaningful, purposeful action coming out of these resolutions. So I wonder what it would really mean in the long run. Thanks.
So just a very, very tiny and very quick comment again on, sorry, my name is Rai and I'm from the Progressive Women's Collective. So just very quickly on, again, taxes, because I understand that that's a lot of, you know, it's tied into everything else we're talking about. But it's, I mean, I just also, you know, just leading on from that conversation, especially of those of us who don't come from the world of economics, but understand the world of women and children, in particular with the work we do. And so I don't think it's as much as not wanting to pay taxes, as much as it's a fear and kind of not being able to be certain that though we are paying taxes, but where does that, who those taxes benefit? I think that's a real question that people have, because there's such little trust in the system, right? And at a time when education, healthcare, transport, when the very basics aren't being met, here we're talking about increasing taxes, but then, you know, we have this system that's falling apart, and everyone else who is just descending from, you know, one place to another. So just this idea of, it's not as much about taxes as people don't want to pay it and they're just not understanding it. They understand it, but they're critical of it. And that is also, I think, in some sense tied in with this Aragalaya, where people now are a little more critical about the system than they were before. We're certainly not the same group of people that existed like, you know, 5-6 months ago. We are a lot more active, we're a lot more thinking, and I think that is, I mean, if you're looking for things that are positive to kind of take away, I think there's that.
So I mean, I completely agree with that point that was brought out earlier. It's not just about incompetence, because I mean, the state, in a sense, the state is full of people who are, could be incompetent, but there's a real interest in keeping the state weak, because if the state was capable, then you're going to see serious problems. Half the government would be there if you had a competent AGs or other kind of ministries. And the question is, why can you tolerate that level of incompetence? Because of the kind of corruption behind it, because of the patronage networks, because you know your job is not on the line. So there's that relationship between corruption and competence. But this question about legitimacy comes in, right? Because I mean, elections will only buy you what you call input legitimacy, gives your government legitimacy to stay there. But on the other hand, you also need sort of output legitimacy. You need to actually produce results, public goods and all of that. And the thing is, it's important for us to realize the two go hand in hand, because if you, I mean, one doesn't compensate for the other, which is why the former president had to flee the country. I mean, you can have all the millions of votes you want. If you can't provide basic food, fuel, and all of that, you're going to be in trouble. I think, but having said that, it's important for us to realize that even sincere efforts by civil society and legislators to improve one without the other moving in lockstep can actually have very negative consequences. I mean, the COPE investigations, for example, so kind of weaponized into this conversation. To mean that the bureaucracies are corrupt, the government is corrupt, everyone is corrupt. And that lack of legitimacy has now made it really difficult to have this conversation about taxes, which is important to boost that output legitimacy. So things you do with with good intentions can have negative outcomes if you're not taking both together at the same time. So that's one thing we have to be careful of. I mean, I personally think, ideally I would love to see a country that is more democratic and inclusive, but given the kind of structural constraints, large agrarian population, yes, there's an informal economy and a whole bunch of other things, I think something we should aspire for, the second best solution, is to keep democracy alive, to maintain a bare minimum amount of input legitimacy through elections, through transparency, but also output. If that just means fuel and things like that to keep the state stable, that would be necessary to keep democracy alive long enough for us to remove the structural impediments over decades, if necessary. So that will be my second best sort of solution, as opposed to, hopefully, ideally, the one that was described would be awesome, but I think if that's not possible, keeping it alive should be our priority.
Yeah, I think just to bring together some of the things that were emerging from the conversation today on corruption, I think no one is really claiming that corruption alone is the cause for this. I think it's very much about inefficiency. It's very much also about how structures have built up over the years that enable this kind of networking to cause private interest to take precedence over public interest. So just quickly, I think it's really clear that rebuilding trust has come through as one of the main things that need to be done in addressing corruption, in getting to accountability, or even solving this problem in the long term. We need to rebuild trust today and start on that journey today. But unfortunately, this is unpopular. It is not politically expedient, and solutions cannot be accomplished within individual electoral cycles, and that is why we don't find these immediate steps being taken. So as I said before, as citizens, as all of the different sectors in this country, we still, in the short term, need to be vigilant, even on asset recovery. As you mentioned, sir, I think there are vested interests at all junctures. We have developed economies benefiting from corruption, from kleptocratic regimes across the world, directly benefiting while seeming to take action on corruption, while performing well on different indices across the world. So international advocacy is happening on all of this. On beneficial ownership transparency, we saw, which is about human ownership, ultimate human ownership of companies, where you're not layering ownership and hiding ownership. We saw the US pass seminal legislation. We saw Canada taking steps, and these are, we see the Financial Action Task Force cracking down. So, the OECD cracking down. So we are seeing movement, again, not in the short term, but even locally we need to keep pushing for these, keep litigating, keep enabling international legislation into our local dualist system. So it's not a short-term thing, but in the immediate present, we really need to be taking the right steps, and it cannot be done alone. Thank you.
Coming out of crisis requires creativity, and at this point on a Friday evening, there's more wisdom to be found in whiskey than in me, so I forfeit my time to Mr. Walker.
Okay, thanks, Daniel, for reminding us of the importance of Friday night revelry. Look, I'm not going to take too long. There's a lot of points that have been raised, and there are a couple of things we'll also be following up on. But the lesson here, I think, one of the key things is we're not going to have overnight change. This is going to be a hard one, managing expectations, and just being realistic. But keeping pressure also on politicians, public officials, and others. I think civil society, think tanks, all of us have a particular role, and it's very easy to point fingers, but we also have to do our part. And I say this to everyone in the room and others watching, is that it's very easy to say the politicians or the opposition or central bank officials are not doing it, but what are we going to do? If you just look at even what happened in the last couple of weeks, a high security zone was created, but how many spoke up? A rehabilitation bill is in Parliament, how many have challenged or spoken up? How many have protested? So we saw the numbers in the last couple of months, people going to the streets, but as soon as the gas and the petrol, everything came about, those reduced. So realistically thinking, what is your role? Civil society role, citizens' role, and it doesn't have to be a lawyer or someone who litigates. There's particular things individuals can do. If you can't do particular things, connect with others. I think one positive thing of Daragale is it opened up spaces. It opened up critical spaces. So while we want to put the pressure on the Harshas and the Irans and the Sumandirans, there are also particular things we also as individuals can do. I mean, what Transparency Chandra did, what we do, what others are doing, litigating is one dimension, protesting is another, coming up with ideas. I would like to also hear more ideas other than going and hanging out with Johnny Walker. But so the whole point is there are things that I think we need to look to in the next couple of months. I mean, I hate to say it, we can't meet again, post the next resolution and say, oops, we missed the boat again. So really things that we would like to be taking forward. Your contacts are with us. We will be in touch in terms of very specific discussions that we would like to see in the next couple of months. But end of the day, I think it's about really kind of looking to spaces, looking to connections. There are particular individuals in the room who didn't speak up, who played a very, very important role in the last couple of years and months. And I think it's to also look to those who don't always speak up and always take the public domain, but who also work behind the scenes and keeping the pressure. So much to do, but I would urge everyone in the room and those connecting virtually to also think of one's own role in the next phase of it and not just look to others for action. Thank you. And have a good evening.
Thanks, Nava. Thank you so much. Hopefully see you again.